Hey, psychology class. This is Professor Gerding. I'm here to teach you, about social psychology, specifically about chapter 12 if you're using the OpenStax book. But even if you're not using the OpenStax book, or you're just clicking around YouTube and you came across this, hey, congratulations. I'm going to do my best to teach you some social psychology. This is the outline of what we're going to be covering, hopefully today. This video is probably going to be cut up into chunks because the software I'm using will only allow me to record 15 minutes. So we're going to do this in 15-minute segments. First, I'm going to tell you what social psychology is, and then I'm going to tell you some amazing true stories. A lot of these stories aren't really happy stories. Some of them are downright horrific, and I have to warn you about that. So there may be some discomfort in this chapter as we learn about it. But it's important to know about these things. I call them inoculation lessons because I'm hoping to inoculate you with some knowledge. What is inoculation? Well, the flu vaccine is a good example of inoculation because if you take the flu vaccine, it's a little bit of the flu that they're giving you. But why are they giving you some of the bad? Because you can develop strength against it, your defenses. So we give you a little bit of the bad so you can make sure it doesn't happen. So by telling you these stories, I'm hoping that you learn a lot and we can do better to make sure these type of things don't happen. So let's get into it and talk about social psychology. The definition of social psychology is the branch of psychology that studies how people think, feel, and behave in social situations. That should be pretty self-explanatory. So when I ask you on the test, and if you're in my class, I'll ask, hey, what is the branch of psychology that studies how people think, feel, and behave in social situations? The answer is easy. You see social, it's social psychology. But what is the difference between sociology and social psychology? Well, sociology is the group mind, how one group of people thinks compared to another group of people. But social psychology, that's zooming in on the individual. How do you think when you're alone versus how do you think and behave and feel when you're with other people? Because we know that you act different in front of groups. Like when you're alone, we know that you take the lightsaber and pretend the lightsaber, screwed that one up. We know you take the remote control and pretend it's the lightsaber. That's what I was trying to say. We know like you dance like a maniac in front of the mirror. I'm a maniac. Or when you're really rocking the music in your car, and you're singing along and dancing, and then someone else pulls up next to your car, straight-faced. You totally act different in front of groups. And we know that not because we have some type of KGB surveillance going on, but no, because we all do that stuff. We all act differently. So here's some examples. So we're going to get serious a bit here. And we're going to talk about the infamous Stanley Milgram experiment from 1963. This is considered the most famous, nay, the most infamous experiment of all of social psychology, probably in all of psychology as well, maybe even all experiments, because what I'm about to tell you is an absolutely true story. And you'll probably figure out or predict what happened at the end, but I want you to experience this as best you can. And if you will, I want you to imagine that you're actually one of the participants in this experiment as I explain it. So imagine I offer you as your professor some extra credit if you participate in this Stanley Milgram experiment. So you think, oh sure, some extra credit, that helps. So you show up and you walk in and you're in Stanley Milgram's laboratory. And Stanley Milgram comes up and says, hey, are you here for the experiment to participate? Of course you say, yes, yeah, that's why I'm here. Good, says Stanley Milgram. What I'm going to need is 2 participants, so we have to wait for the second one. I'm going to keep setting up. You just wait here in the waiting area. So you do what you're told you're waiting, and then some guy shows up. He's overweight. He's this white guy in his middle age, and he's out of breath like he just ran up 3 stories of stairs. He's the kind of guy that snores even when he's awake. And he tries to catch his breath, and he's like, is this... damn it, is it the experiment? Is this where the experiment is? And you being a polite person say, yeah, this is where the experiment is. Like, good, and he collapses in a chair. Now, as you're imagining being here, I'm going to continually remind you, imagine this is you and you're one of those participants. So Stanley Milgram walks in and says, oh, good, you're both here. Let me explain the experiment. I want to experiment on pain's influence on one's ability to memorize and recall. He explains it further, saying he's going to assign 2 jobs, one to each of you, and it's going to be random, so you don't know what job you're going to get. One of you is going to get the simple job of being a learner. He explains that the learner's job is simply answering questions. They're going to be trivia-like questions, but no worries, you're going to get the answers to these questions before the experiment even begins, so you have a chance to memorize them. But what happens is, you're going to be strapped to this device, and it's basically an electric chair. He doesn't say that, but I'm telling you. It was basically an electric chair. Your arm gets strapped in, and your job is to simply answer the questions. Anytime you get a question wrong, you're going to get a shock. But every shock is going to be more severe than the previous one. So the more questions you get wrong, the more painful the shocks are going to be. That is the learner's job. The other job is the teacher job. You're going to be in a separate room asking questions with this 2-way intercom system, and they're prepared questions. And any time that the learner gets a question wrong, your job is going to be hitting a switch, which will initiate a shock. Then as they get more and more questions wrong, the shock's going to be more and more severe. This is the experiment that Stanley Milgram explains. And I want you to ask yourself, you're standing there, you can probably see the potential problems with this experiment, but would you go on? Would you participate in this experiment now that it is explained to you? You don't know if you're going to get the job of the learner or the teacher yet, but would you continue? Because one thing I want you to realize is it's so easy for us to say, no, I wouldn't do that, when we're here talking about it. I mean, I've painted this picture already, that this is an infamous experiment, that these are horrible stories we're going to be talking about today. So you're probably thinking, no, I won't do it. But it's easy for us, because imagine you're actually there. And that makes it much more difficult to say, because what would you actually say? No, this sounds horrible. I'm not going to participate. I'm sorry, you're going to have to find another participant. Even though I signed up for this in advance, and I know you probably can't even do the experiment without me, too bad. I'm out of here. What would you say? Because you're realizing that in your back of your head. Well, let me just tell you that this person that I'm pretending that I want you to pretend that you are actually went through with the experiment. So the jobs are assigned, and you get the job as teacher, which is probably good because you were probably thinking you wanted the job as learner. No, I'm sorry. You probably were thinking you want the job as teacher. Why are you thinking that you wanted the job as teacher? Not because you're sick and you want to hurt someone, but more because you didn't want to be the one getting hurt. So in this actual record of this experiment that happened, we realize that this overweight gentleman became the learner. So what happened next? Well, Stanley Milgram goes ahead and he explains the experiment again as he's strapping this guy into this chair and explains, here's your list, memorize the answers, do your best, don't get them wrong. Do you have any questions? And this is the amazing thing. We actually have this on record. This overweight gentleman says, I have a heart condition. Is that going to be a problem? To which Stanley Milgram answers, well, it's designed to increase in volts, not amps. So that's supposed to stimulate pain, but not actually cause any physiological response. So no, it shouldn't be a problem. Stanley Milgram says it shouldn't be a problem. This is the equivalent of him saying, don't worry about it, and then walking on. And then he brings you into his office because these are 2 separate rooms, and he sits you in front of this device. And we actually have a picture of this device. I'm going to bring it up here. And here you can see this device starts at one side and goes to the other. These are the shocks that you're going to be administering to the learner. So each of the shocks get more and more severe. And they start at 15 volts, and they go all the way up to 450 volts is at the very end. And in case Stanley Milgram was worried you didn't know what that felt like, there is actually things written, little euphemisms written underneath them. For instance, under 15 it says slight shock, and then it increases to moderate shock. But at the very end here, if you look, there's this ambiguous XXX, which is like the equivalent of drawing a skull and crossbones, in my opinion, right? So what would you do? Would you, at this point, say, whoa, ridiculous, XXX, Like, I don't feel comfortable doing this. Well, this participant went on. Would you go on? That's the question. So, what happened? Well, the participant's going and the learner's going and the experiment seems to be going fine, but then he gets his first question wrong. And being the willing participant, you go ahead and you hit the first button for the first shock. And it's a two-way intercom, so you do hear a response from that shock. And it's just a little, not much, that kind of bothered. But eventually gets another question wrong, and it goes to the next level of shock. So you shock them, and you hear the same kind of noise again, but it's a little more severe. So you can even hear in this guy's voice that it's getting more painful. Would you stop at that point? Probably not, to be honest, because it's not too uncomfortable yet. What would you say? Not sure. Maybe you would. Maybe some of you listening to this would have not even started this thing. Like, this is sick, whatever. And I hope that is actually the case. But what happened in this case? Well, I'll tell you. Because we actually have on record some of the things that this guy said. And it only got worse. Because at 120 volts, he says, "Ugh, hey, this really hurts." At 150 volts, because this participant kept going on, "Ugh, experimenter, that's all, get me out of here. I told you I had heart trouble. My heart's starting to bother me now." This guy's complaining about his heart. Would you continue at this point? Because I'd like to believe at that point I'd say, "Hey, Stanley Milgram, this guy is really complaining. His heart's bothering him. We should really stop." Now, to this participant's credit, because we have it on record, this participant did say something. He turned to Stanley Milgram and he said, he's really in pain. He really wants to stop. His heart's bothering him. To which Stanley Milgram looked up from grading papers or doing whatever he was doing in his office, and he says, "You must continue. We've already started. Continue." He tells the participant, "Keep going." Would you at this point? Because now there's this line kind of drawn in the sand. Saying no at this point means confrontation. And this participant kept going on. I don't know if you would, but let's just imagine that you kept on going on at 300. There's an agonizing scream. "I absolutely refuse to answer anymore. Get me out of here. Get me out of here." But he kept on going. And he didn't just turn to Stanley Milgram once, but a couple of times. In fact, it gets worse. Because after 330 volts, where the gentleman screamed, "Let me out of here, my heart's bothering me, let me out, I tell you," the participant kept going, and the learner got the question wrong, and with the next shock, there was no noise. There was no scream, there was no anything. So what happened? Well, the participant turned to Stanley Milgram and said, "He's not making any noise." And in fact, the participant asked the next question. And when he asked the next question, there was no response. So this guy turns, and I'm revealing that it was a man, in fact, and this participant turned and said, "Hey, Stanley Milgram, this guy's not even answering questions anymore. He's not making any noise." Stanley Milgram says this: "No response is the same as an incorrect response. Continue." Would you continue? I think most of you listening to this would have stopped by this point, but did this participant, and you can see why this is the most infamous experiment, this participant didn't. This participant took it all the way to 450 volts. Stanley Milgram not really paying attention, just saying, "Yeah, just keep going, keep going, keep going." Allowed this participant to go all the way to 450 volts, basically shocking a guy that isn't even responsive anymore. What the hell happened? But I think I have a more important question for you. And that is, who do we blame? Who's to blame for this horrible experiment in 1963? Now, the laws are different, and I'm not going to pretend to be some kind of lawyer, but who's to blame? You would think Stanley Milgram, right? He set up this experiment. He's the one who conducted it. He's the one who said, "Keep on going." But let's think for a second. Let's suppose I were to throw you a handgun, and I were to say to you, "Hey, shoot that person," and you shot that person and killed them. Well, would you then be to blame? Or Stanley Milgram? Or both? Who would you blame? Is it the participant or is it Stanley Milgram? And if you're blaming both of them, who gets more blame? basically who gets more time in prison, right?